Hey friends, welcome back to the Invitation Podcast. Kyle here.
Phil here.
Today we're diving into Season 3, Episode 5, and this is going to be titled Here. And we'll be diving into Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9. Maybe one of the coolest sounding books of the Bible. But before we jump into the content, let's do a quick recap on what we learned in Numbers. What do you got for us, Phil?
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. Yeah, Deuteronomy. It's always nicknamed Dutes in my head, admittedly. So you just got in my head already in this episode. And yeah, last episode we covered the book of Numbers by looking at an episode we titled The Fruit or the Boot. And we looked at the spies entering into the promised land, coming back with some giant fruit from the vine, and the response of the Israelites was one of courage, but also one of fear. And we came to the conclusion of what it means to live out our salvation, knowing that the fruit we see is both a blessing and a sign of more to come. Right? The fruit that God gives us is both a promise and a test of our character, which is really interesting to think about. And then we learn from getting nerdy with names to respond with a dog-like quality in faith back to God when he gives us fruit that comes with promises and comes with tests. But today we're going to focus on this word here. And the focus is going to be what in Hebrew is called the shema. This is maybe the most famous prayer in Jewish tradition. It still happens twice a day, every day in religious Jewish communities. It is the center of both the morning and the evening prayer that Jewish people have prayed for literally thousands of years at this point. So even Kyle, even right now, as we are recording this in the evening, there are faithful Jewish believers that might be getting home from work and pausing to recite this very prayer in concert with their ancestors of thousands of years that have done the same exact thing when they have come back from the fields or come back from their jobs or whatever. And so with that, as you said, today's passage is going to be Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 through 9. Are listening and you want to get your Bibles out, feel free to follow along because we'll be camping there. And Kyle, take it away. Go ahead and read it.
Excellent. Here we go. It's going to be from the NIV, Deuteronomy 6, starting in verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. The Shema, this prayer, is verses 4 through 5. So the Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. That is the Shema, and the rest are instructions about the Shema. And so first, what we're going to look at as we break down this whole passage is that the word Shema comes from the very first word in the prayer. The Hebrew word for hear is Shema. And so that's where we get that word for the whole of the prayer. And this word for hear, for listen, right? It's a command, it's a beckoning, not only, well, I'm spilling the beans a little bit, but not only just for the prayer, but I also think it has something to do with a posture that the Israelites were supposed to maintain, not only through the prayer, but through their lives. And Kyle, can you think of any other instance in our past and going through the Bible where listening or hearing God was mentioned, was in the context of what we looked at?
I'm just going to go out on a limb and guess that it's going to be a passage in Genesis.
That's right. Anyone that spends any amount of time with me knows that the answer is most likely probably Genesis 1, 2, or 3. You are right. I actually don't know if this is the exact first instance of shema being listed. I did not look that up, to be honest, but it is an important part here. It's Genesis 3:17, and without reading the whole of that verse or even the rest of the context of Genesis 3, we know that this is the chapter where the man and the woman sin. They listen to the voice of the serpent, and this is confirmed in God's judgment, particularly towards the man. He doles out judgment to the serpent, to the woman, and then to the man. And when he talks to the man, he says, because you listened to your wife. And that word listened is the same exact word. It's shema. And so this word, when God commands Israel to shema, this word would be familiar to them in this way of like, when we first heard this word, or one of the biggest instances that we first hear this word, it's much to our shame. No pun intended there. They didn't know the English word shame back then. But they would have recalled, like, when God first spoke this word to humanity, it was to our shame. It was to the fact that not that just that they listened to the wives. It's not that was breaking some sort of commandment.
Right.
It's the fact that they listened to their wife about eating the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, when God had told the man specifically earlier not to eat of it, right? So he had already shemad the voice of God saying, don't eat from that tree, but instead he shemad the voice of his wife saying, you should eat this with me. I'll pause there. Any thoughts on any of that before I go forward?
Just had one job.
Right. But isn't it interesting that, like, the way that God could have given pages and pages of understanding to the man about what his downfall was like. And he decided to use this word to summarize it. You listen to the voice behind the voice of your wife, right? You ultimately listen to the serpent side of the voice of your wife. And that was your downfall.
See, now it makes me want to do an entire episode on discernment and how it's not just in a time of study or big decisions. It's actually when you're moving through life and listening to conversations around you, even with your loved ones. So maybe we'll put a pin in that one and come back to it.
Well, I was hinting at that exact fact when I said this isn't just a command for this prayer, it's a posture. Yeah. It's a posture that God's people should always be listeners, careful listeners. We should, more than any other group of people, I believe, those that proclaim the faith that you and I proclaim in Jesus Christ, right, should be ones that are careful to listen, and to listen thoroughly, not only to the people across the table from us, but then to the voices that are going on in our heart, and then the voices of those that we trust. Like, we should be deep listeners, because it's part of who we are from the beginning. And here's this amazing part. Here's where I'll land this plane about shema, right? Like, of hearing, is not only is God hearkening back to this dastardly moment from Genesis 3, he's giving us a redemption, right? Here's a redemptive opportunity to use your ears for good. And what does he tell us to listen to? Well, let's keep moving on. He says, love the Lord your God. He says, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. So we'll get into the next part here in a minute, but the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Now, before we started recording, I nerded out on you. I'm not going to totally nerd out, because this would be going from 101 to 201 to 301 on this one. So I'm not going to go there, but I'm going to read word for word the note that I wrote down here. And that is this. We will save this for another time, but to understand that Yahweh, we talked about that in a previous episode, this name for God is just one God, is ultimately a timely blessing to the ancient Near Eastern people, the ancient Near Eastern Israelites, because they didn't always have to then concern themselves with which God do I appease, and how do I locate where that God is to be worshipped. And through the Old and New Testaments, the issue of polytheism was in the air. Okay, well, if we got to appease this God, we got to go make a pilgrimage to Ephesus and worship Artemis, and then we have to go over to Rome and worship Caesar, and then we have to come back to Greece and worship this god to appease this god because I'm not experiencing blessing there, and then I gotta run over to this other town to worship that god, right? And so for the ancient Near Eastern Israelites to learn that their God is one and is available in that oneness, that monotheism, it's such a huge blessing to not have to always be chasing down the gods and trying to figure out like, oh, which god are we supposed to worship to get this blessing and to get this god off our
How
back
about
and to
it?
stop these curses. And so that's about all we're going to say here, even though I've got 2-3 other levels of depth to that particular one. But so we're supposed to listen to this one God with his one voice, right? We don't have to concern ourselves with many voices. And oftentimes in the polytheism of the day, there were opposing voices. The gods were at war with each other all the time. So which
Right.
which one of the gods is the greatest? Like that was in the air as well. So yeah, can you imagine or say anything to the relief of knowing that there's only one God, Kyle, either for them or what that might mean for us today?
Yeah, I think the big thing is when you're having questions come up, typically around understanding certain passages in the Bible. Oftentimes, here's where really good teaching around what is happening in the culture, what's culturally significant at the time that these words were written, and it really brings a lot of light to shed onto the passages and helps you, what I like to say, put your kind of boots on the ground during the biblical times, and you get a lot more understanding. So if you
Hmm.
understand that this is kind of what's going on in the culture, then it makes sense that this would be a refreshing message.
Yeah, for sure. And then to push that the whole way through time into the present day. If our God is one, right, univocal in his voice to us, to bear God's image in the world would mean that the people of God should be united as well in their voice of his love and the bearing of his image. And it doesn't take long, even in the Old Testament, for this kingdom that enters into the promised land to become a divided kingdom.
Mm,
It just takes a couple books. And
mm.
then I don't know about you, but I, I have experienced Christianity long enough to realize it's not very unified in its current state here in North America. So that's all I'm going to say on that one, unless you want to put any weight
Man,
out there any further than I
I
just
don't,
did. Yeah,
I'll pull the
let's not
pin.
toss
I
it.
don't care. I ain't scared. I think that's something that is distracting. I think it's I hope that we have listeners that are kind of looking at that and they're like, yeah, I don't I don't want to do this, that, or the other, and belong to a certain denomination when my friends are over at this denomination, but I didn't grow up that way. I think we need to recognize that we outside of, I like the sphere model, right? Inside
Mhm.
here, right? It's the stuff that we're talking about today. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, or mind. We'll get to that in a bit, but
Mhm.
that's here, right? And love your neighbor as yourself. That's here, okay? And then there's preferences out here that are a little less important than this, but still pretty important. And then there's stuff out here like what kind of worship music do you like? Okay, we can still get along. Coming back to a certain unity, right? And I'll be as brief as possible here. I remember moving back to the East Coast from being out west and being asked this question repeatedly that I was never asked out west. Again, culture is important, right? And so I was asked, "Oh, what church do you go to?" And I couldn't help escape the feeling that there was a wrong answer.
Mm. Wow.
And I think it's illustrative of the divisive nature when it doesn't have to be divisive.
Yeah, when we
And
seek
so
out the divisiveness.
yeah, yep.
Yeah.
So I think again, if we're to be Christ-like, we can strive to stay in that place which takes us to unity
Hmm.
and not a place of divisiveness, and it helps us to stay attractive to, I think when people admit it in their heart of hearts, they're attracted to Jesus, they're attracted to that love. But as they approach, there's these barriers that I believe, have been put in place in the name of religion, not in the name of becoming more Christ-like. So there you have it.
Nice. You did a good job of not fully throwing the grenade out there, but I like
Yeah,
that.
we got
Nice
to keep
job.
it tight. We got a lot to
Nice
cover this
job.
show. But
Nice job. That was great. That was really good. Yeah, there's a ton we could say there, and the cap I'll put on it is in the Beatitudes in Matthew. It says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be sons of God." Right, and we were just talking about like what does it mean to bear His image in this unity? Well, bearing someone's image is like being the child of them, right? And so, but let's continue on. We've got a lot more to cover here, and the next line here is probably the line that if you're listening and you're new to this passage in Deuteronomy, the next line is the line you've probably heard before, the part that starts to ring through the chorus of the song in the way that you're familiar with. And it says in verse 5, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength." And so, I'm not trying to be coy, but what does that mean, Kyle? Like, what does that mean to you? What does it mean to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength?
I think talking about oneness, right? There's a unity. I think about the renewing of the mind, which leads to a certain oneness versus a split of,
Mm-hmm.
I know I'm supposed to do this, but here's what my flesh wants to do. And so the more we can bring these together, the more we can experience that unity, and the more we actually live this out.
Mm-hmm.
I like to think about it like an elite athlete. Chances are, if you toss any object at an elite athlete, they will catch it. They're
Mm-hmm.
not going to think about it. They can't not catch it, right? If you walk up to an elite fighter and you go to punch them in the face, before you know it, they're going to dodge, and then you're probably going to be on the ground. Think about this, right? This is a response
Yeah.
that is so ingrained in their being. It's so well worn, right? So what happens if we're so Christ-like that when things happen to us, we can't help but to respond in a way that's Christ-like, right?
Yeah.
It's to me, that's the aspirational nature. How do we make this like breathing? How do we
Mm-hmm.
drive towards this? And then, and this one's kind of off the top, so bear with me, the unique strengths that he's given us, how do
Mm-hmm.
we use those giftings to amplify his goodness and put it out in the world in a way that only you can do because you are uniquely gifted as
Mm-hmm.
such?
Yeah, good. Good, good, good. Yeah, I've got a slightly different perspective on it, not a differing one by any means, but this idea of like loving God with our heart, our soul, and our strength. Like we just got done talking about unity in the body, and now this is like wholeness, right? And so same thing in a lot of ways, right? This like, a united front would be a whole front, right?
Yep.
Like everybody's in, everyone's all in. And I think this verse sort of speaks to, I think what you were getting at as like this kind of within myself, the whole of myself is ready all the time to bear the image of God. And there's also a collective nature to this
Mhm.
command as well. Hear
I like that.
Israel, love the Lord your God with all your strength, with all your heart, with all your soul, right? And so you could, you could almost see like these three different adjectives, like heart, soul, strength, and almost maybe like seeing like different parts of different tribes, like with all your heart, and you see all the feelers come alive a little bit, right? With all your
Mm,
soul, and all the thinkers and all the ones that like have like a richness and a depth to the way they go about the world. But then all the strength, right? So all the farmers and all the builders and all, right? They all like have something that they, and man or woman in any of those cases, right? Like you can
right.
almost see them like all lighting up as each one is read off, and by the end everyone is like kind of lit, with the light
Hmm.
of like, we are all available to love the Lord our God with everything we have. And so there's this individual wholeness, oneness to us that is supposed to not let the flesh or not let anything divide our own consciousness to say, well, I'm gonna love God on Sunday, but when I get around the boys, when I get around the fellas, going to be something else, right? But then it's also this entirety, right? That my whole tribe needs to be reflected. And the last thing I'll say here is, when we started with saying being a good listener, right, and having the posture of listening, well, that means anybody in the body of Christ, anybody in the tribe, right, that is attempting to follow God, I'm going to listen to them because they have strengths that I don't. And if I'm just writing them off, or if I'm just
Mm,
putting them aside, or if they don't quite have strengths that fit the culture right now, right? Like, oh well, maybe we'll call upon you at another time in another decade or something, right? No, that's not this verse. This verse says to come before the Lord with everybody's strengths. And you are alluding to that too, right? But you have to be a good listener. One of the things I'm really proud of the organization that I work for, the CCO, which I try and leave them out of this podcast a little bit, but we work in a ministry that demands an extrovert nature. You have to be able to be good with people, but we still hire introverts because we see the value of reaching other introverts. We
right.
see the value that introverts brings to our organization when we're working on teams. And so we don't just write ourselves off or write ourselves into a narrow passage of what it looks like to do campus ministry. We're consistently hiring introverts and those that maybe wouldn't on the surface be deemed, a campus minister that's going out there and making waves of thousands of people. Oh, those introverts have a strength as well that they bring to campus ministry. So yeah,
Yeah. No,
any
that's
other thoughts
good.
on that?
I mean, other than someone that married a soulful introvert that routinely impacts the lives of others, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I think that's it's a good word.
Mm. Well, I hope she tunes into this one and gets to
I
hear
hope so.
that
I don't
and
know if
gets to
she
hear the
thinks
lesson too.
that my podcast is as cool as as she does, but we can hope.
Yeah. Well,
Maybe,
hey,
maybe if she knows she gets a shout out, we'll see.
well, shout out indeed. Well, Kyle, earlier you I don't know if you slipped or did this on purpose, but you read the word mind in there, and that's the way that this passage is read by Jesus himself. Jesus himself in Matthew 22 says, the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind instead of strength. What do you think? Or what do you think's going on there? Or what's your take on why is Jesus doing the old switcheroo from strength to
Yeah,
mind here?
that's a great question. Knowing the Lord, I doubt it's a switcheroo, but I think in terms of like the focus here, I know for me that's one of the most powerful motivators and drivers because I know that I can act in a certain way that's in accordance with every aspect of how I'm supposed to show up in this world, how I'm
Mm,
supposed to um, portray myself, how I'm supposed to address, what I'm supposed to drive, how I'm supposed to keep my house, how I'm supposed to treat other people in certain situations. But I can think the opposite.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I can think
Yep,
the exact opposite. Um, and
good.
so, that's where when the Lord gets a hold of you and starts the renewing of the mind, and you there's that thought of taking every thought captive. Whoa, okay, now it's time. Now it's time to level up. Now it's time to really examine what are the conversations that happen between these two ears, and how do I turn that from my own selfish nature, my own sinful nature, to that of the Lord's, to seeing people through his eyes, having thoughts and compassions and greater levels of care than my selfish nature would lend itself to put out there in the world. And again, incredibly aspirational. That's one that comes back to me on a good amount of occasions.
Yeah, that's really good. Really good. Here's one thing that I think is going on. I don't think it's the only thing that's going on. It's not just a switcheroo. It's not the shell game. It's in ancient Israel time, we already alluded to like polytheism being in the air, this worship of many gods, and the gods were always at each other, trying to compete for who the greatest god was. And those competitions, they weren't like, well, let's go to trivia night and see who knows the most, and then whoever wins, right? It was always war, right? Like it was
Always war.
They didn't sit down and play board games and decide who was going to win, or I mean, they didn't rock paper scissors it.
The Greek gods are sitting around trading sheep for ore and settlers.
Sure, right? Yeah, they're not building decks of magic cards and like facing off with each other. They were always violent with each other, and so it's actually not a surprise to me that strength is listed here, because the Israelites needed to rely on a God that was strong. And one of the courses in the Old Testament is like with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, right? So think about a really muscular arm with an outstretched hand doing something of might. It totally like makes sense that this is what the Israelites sort of, if you will, they need to hear. They need to hear that they're being led with a God that is mighty, that is strong.
So it's knowing the audience here.
That's right. And they also need to be strong. They're trekking through the wilderness. There's giants out there, right? If you listen to our previous episode, there's giants out there, and there's walls and there's armies. And we are just a bunch of vagabond former slaves, trekking through the desert. We don't have ramparts. We don't have, we only have the weapons that we picked up on the way. Like it's looking scarce, it's looking pretty grim. So they need to be strong as a nation right here. Now, fast forward to the time of Jesus, oh gosh, I should have looked this up, but there may be ish years, maybe more than that now I think about it, maybe 800-ish years into, you actually alluded to it, into Greek philosophy, right? And even though the Greeks were defeated by Rome carried with them all of the philosophical goods of Greek and even their gods, right? So
right.
carried
It
with
typically
them
happened in different reigns throughout the ages.
Yep. And what ruled the universe in Greek philosophical thought was not necessarily war. It was logos. It was wisdom. And it's where we get the word logic. And so now with that in the air, with that, this sort of like, it's wisdom that runs the world, which was also a Hebrew thought, but that could be a left turn that I don't need to take right now. We'll get there when we get to the book of Proverbs. Love the Lord your God with all your mind as well. It just makes sense. It makes sense that those people in that time would have the same exact reaction to the people 2,000 years earlier that heard strength instead. The same exact reaction of, well, of course I would need to have a strong mind to worship God with here to make it in today's culture. But yet I need to focus that mind not on this ethereal wisdom that's out there and can't be found. That wisdom came in the form of Jesus and revealed himself. And now we know what that wisdom is. So that I'm preaching now, but that's I think some of that is going on in there. And I think what you said is justifiable too. And any thoughts on what I said before I lead us onward?
No, it's good. I mean, I think, again, it's yet another example of knowing what's happening, boots on the ground, and understanding what that looks like in the context of the changing times over the years, that different years when these specific passages were penned.
Yeah, it's so great. And it's a good reminder for us, especially us that long to teach others, to always be learning not only like what is God's word getting at, but what is my audience hearing? And the best teachers are transposers, they're translators. They're able to hear in one ear and speak out of their mouth and say the same thing with different words going on. And that ability to translate is huge for any teacher. It's not necessary for everybody. I'm not saying every Christ follower has to be a great translator, but if you're looking to be a good teacher, you always have to be playing around with like, what am I hearing, and what's the Bible saying, and what's the Bible saying to those people at that time? What words do I need to be able to deliver that message here and now without changing its meaning? And that's not always easy.
It's an art.
I'm gonna push us forward here with the time that we have remaining, and I'll hit this next verse pretty quickly. These commandments, verse 6, these commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. And one thing that I found fascinating here, Kyle, is that we often link up our hearts and our minds when we talk about, where do we put these commandments? Well, we put them in our mind and we think about them, and they get into our hearts. The ancient people, the interchangeable aspect of this wasn't their hearts and their minds, it was their hearts and their liver. And you were hinting at this earlier, so I'm gonna like take us down that road again, where it's like, what does it mean for these commandments to be on their hearts and in their livers? Well, it's to be this umption, this instinct, that these commands aren't just things that they have to like run back to their desk and look it up and type it in Bible Gateway, which I'm plenty guilty of. I'm terrible at memorization, to be honest. But these commandments are supposed to be kind of like become instinct, to be practiced in a way that it's not just that they love the law, it's not that just they've memorized the law, but the law becomes this response, this kind of instinct, this gut feeling towards their circumstances in life. And when it's not that, then we pause and we go seek out wisdom, and we go seek out others that seem to have this down and say, what does your gut say? What does your liver say? We would never say that. But not only what does your heart and your mind say, but what does your gut say? And I think that's a good lesson for us too, to say, let's not always just get stuck in our heads. I'm so guilty of this. I love podcasts. I love books. I love teachings and sermons. But developing the instinct of the wisdom from those is what this verse is actually getting at.
Yeah, that's good.
And then we're supposed to impress that on our children, is what the next verse says. So impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. And, those specifics are specific. But the idea is we're not afraid to act on them when we're having deep conversations, or when we're hosting a podcast and trying to like get these lessons. We're also supposed to think about these things when we're making our morning coffee, and when we're driving on the road, and when our 5-year-olds are sticking food up their nose, and when we're watching the latest sitcom with our friends. We're supposed to instinctively think about these things as it's going on. Right. I've become a big fan of The Office, and I should have prepped one, but I've been thinking a lot about the anxiety that each character has, and what the Bible would actually say to each one of the characters' anxieties, because of a podcast I listened to that actually introduced that topic, and they digested a whole episode with that lens. And now I'm thinking about it all the time. And in that sense, I'm actually taking this, like, not only when I pray with my wife and my kids, but also when I watch The Office and doing the dishes, I'm actually like kind of testing myself. Oh, if I had that anxiety, I think I would go to this Bible verse with this idea in mind. And this is what I would say to Jim. And this is what I would say to Dwight right now, if they were able to hear me. Thoughts on that one, Kyle?
I think that's a good word. I think trusting your gut, I think, can get taken a lot of ways in today's culture. But I think that there's, when done improperly, can go off the rails. But when done properly, the Bible talks about asking the Lord for wisdom and his promise to provide it generously. If we're doing that, He probably has given us a lot of really good answers. So again, there's a nod to discernment, but in this general discussion, trusting the gut can be a pretty powerful way to move some things forward.
I love that you brought us full circle, because trust in the gut is a form of hearing. It's a form of listening to ourselves, listening to God, and trusting that God is in there, right? God is,
Mhm.
uh, my 5-year-old just randomly said that the other day. God, she said something like, my prayers go to Jesus, but Jesus is also in my heart. I was like, yeah. And I just let it lie. I love that. I love when kids find attention, because I don't want to resolve it right away. I want them to explore that mystery. Like, yeah, isn't that great?
That's
And I
good.
could see the confusion, but also a little bit of the delight of like, well, if my
Yeah.
dad says that's great, then it must be great. I saw that on her face too. And so yeah,
Uh,
like that gut instinct stuff is also a form of shema, and especially, and we only find out when we act on it, right? We only find out, well, was it really God? You actually have to act. You actually have to do it to find out, which is also a really peculiar aspect of listening. Yeah, nice word there. Well, I am excited about these final two verses. There's an interesting finale I have up my sleeve here. So, verse 8 says, "Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads." Verse 9 says, "Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates." Now, I'm going to work backwards here. So, verse 9 with "write them on the door frames of your house and on your gates," right? There's this obvious allusion to, okay, like in some form or another, write these laws in the places of transition, which I really think is interesting, right? Like these door frames and gates are their transition places that remind you that, like, wherever you're coming from or wherever you're going to, you want to keep reminding yourself in those transition spaces as
yeah.
well. But Kyle, the door frames of our houses, we just recently talked about that. Can you remember where we talked about that?
Was that Exodus?
Yes,
So
it
that's
was
going to
Exodus.
be the door frames and having the lamb's blood to denote
Yeah.
those homes that were protected by the Lord.
That's right. Yep, exactly. And this would have been real recent memory for all these folks. Every single one of these folks that are hearing this command, they're only there because they shemad to the command to sacrifice a blameless sheep and take its blood and put it on the door frames on that exact, part of their house. And now, when they finally do get settled in the promised land, instead of blood, they're supposed to put these commands, which, like, the symbolism here is pretty rich. So in the place of salvific blood, to use a very big word, right? In the place of the symbol of blood that was grace and that was protection and salvation to every single one of these wilderness Israelites, when they finally settle home, it's not blood they're supposed to put there, it's these commands. And
Mm.
so these commands in these transition spaces, they serve as reminders of the law and reminders to listen to God, but it also says, in this exact place in your heart where you have salvation on your heart, where you
Mm.
experienced the protection of the Lord, these commands now serve as protection.
Hmm.
These commands now serve as the way of rescue. And I want to be clear here, it's not that the commandments rescue them, but the commandments keep them on the way. They keeps them on the
Yeah, some
path.
guide rails there.
Yeah, it keeps
Yep.
them on Salvation Boulevard, right? Like it keeps them on that road, and keeps them from straying to other paths that would lead to
Right.
destruction, right?
Right.
You sitting on anything there? You got a thought before I go on?
Carry on.
Okay, so then going going back a verse, tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Now, I, I live in rural Pennsylvania, and there's no synagogue here that I'm aware of. But for those of us that live in the city, you might pass by a synagogue or something and see uh, Jewish priests that actually have like little boxes or perhaps little scrolls that are actually like kind of tied to their headwear, like right on their forehead, and sometimes hanging from the wrist. It might be like a little scroll, and sometimes it's really tiny, or a little box, it almost looks like a trinket. I don't want to diminish it by any means by saying trinket, but or diminuize it, but like it might look like a little box. And these are still a reflection of this verse from thousands of years before, that these Jewish leaders would still wear these on their wrists and on their foreheads. And that's amazing, because again, there's tons of symbolism we could go into there of what does it mean to be on your forehead and on your wrist, right? Like, and we've kind of already talked about it, in your mind and in your strength, and there's some obvious symbolism there. But these commands that are on their wrists and on their foreheads and that keep them on Salvation Boulevard, we know that the commands can't ultimately save them, right? I just said that. But there will be a day where, in places where these scrolls and where these boxes with these commands on them, on their hands and on their forehead, there's going to be the Jewish high priest in himself, Jesus, that's going to have a crown of thorns and blood on his forehead. And instead of commands, he's going to have blood seeping from his hands, weeping from his hands, to remind us that it really is the sacrifice of a perfect lamb that saves us. And so when we follow these commands, and even when we remind ourselves of these commands, we are somehow unifying ourselves with the salvation work of Jesus himself. We are somehow reminding our very lives of the exodus of our own souls from sinful ways into righteous ways, onto Salvation Boulevard, right? And so it's not just, I don't want it to be confused for, we have to follow the rules to be saved, right? That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying when we keep these rules in our ears, when we shema them, right? When we continue to listen to them over and over and again, that we do all the efforts to remind ourselves of them, and they become our gut instinct, and we lift up those around us as well with their strengths and with their soul, with their heart and with their mind. When we're doing all these things, we're proclaiming the salvation of the Lord. We're proclaiming the bloodshed of the Lord that died to set everyone free, died to say, you too are worthy of forgiveness and salvation. You too are chosen to have God's love and mercy and grace revealed to you through blood. So follow these commands, make the most of these commands, memorize these commands, make these commands form in your liver somehow, and walk them out on Salvation Boulevard. Thoughts?
It's powerful.
Yeah.
Powerful. I think it comes back to what was the ultimate sacrifice, the perfect, blameless sacrifice, and to weave it together into yet another reminder of what he's done for us is pretty wild.
It's pretty nuts. And the fact that, and I'm gonna shout out to the Bible Project, but also just steal a part of their ethos, that these books really do point us back to Jesus all the time. If we spend a little time with them, if we get them into our gut a little bit, right? And it's part of the reason why I love going back to Genesis 1, 2, and 3, is because I think those point back to Jesus, right? It's kind of this like ping-pongy rebound effect that points us back to God's ultimate purposes revealed in Jesus and fulfilled in Jesus. But we were given the framework of those things all the way back in the first 3 chapters, so that when we come to this very important prayer that still is a landmark prayer for the Jewish people today, in the listening of this podcast, there are Jewish people practicing this prayer for thousands of years. We still can say, wow, there's something rich here that points me back to Jesus and his rescue, his salvation of my life. I need to pay attention then. I need to pay attention to Deuteronomy in a new way. I need to pay attention to Leviticus in a new way. And that's why we spend the time doing these episodes, is to invite others to also consider what the Bible is inviting them to, this life that reflects the life of Jesus. So speaking of invitations, Kyle, are you sitting on any invitations in the consideration of what we've talked about on this show today?
not any that are easy to articulate, other than the fact that these are good reminders to take with you into your weeks. Don't let this discourage you. Let this be something that encourages you to what the body of Christ can look like in unity. What paying attention to these things can do for your body and your mind. And I think that's probably enough to work on for this week.
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah, so the invitation summarized here that hopefully are clear by now, but I'll still recap a little bit is, to lean into what it means to hear God rightly, right? We talked about scriptures, we talked about listening to each other, being deep listeners, but also going with your gut and having to live into those gut instincts. They're all forms of listening. And so to be a people that listen and listen well. Gosh, I would just love it if by the end of my lifetime, Christianity had a stereotype of, well, those guys are great listeners.
Yeah.
That would be amazing. One of the invitations is to, once again, love God with every aspect of our lives. We covered that 2 episodes ago in the Leviticus episode, the Jubilee episode. But it's here again with love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your strength, with all your soul. But not only us individually, but corporately, our tribe, right? Our people. And so we are to do that in a way that's not only as individuals, but also as communities. And so with that, I will close with this. May you hear God, may you shema God, and speak of God in ways that are unified by his love of you and those around you.
Thanks for listening to the Invitation Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, kindly invite others, see what I did there, Kyle, to listen in by sharing it with a friend, posting about it on social media, or even leaving a rating and a review.
To catch all the latest and greatest, give us a follow on Instagram, Facebook, or X at The Invitation Pod, and help us share the invitation with others. Thanks again. We hope you'll tune in to future episodes.
Blessed are the peacemakers. Oh my gosh, I'm going to start that one over. Blessed are the P. Really, Phil? Cut.